For Parshas Chukas, I'd like for us to discuss three parts at the beginning of the Parsha that are put together, that are there one after the other, and many of the Meforshim try to explain what they are doing adjacent to each other. The three things that I'd like to discuss today and try to figure out what they're doing next to each other will help us actually understand one of the most difficult and cryptic passages of the Torah, which is the story of Mei Merivah, the story of what caused Moshe and Avraham to be denied entry into Eretz Yisrael and have to die in the desert before reaching the Promised Land. The three passages from Parshas Chukas are, number one, the mitzvah of the Para Aduma, which we know had already been commanded at the very beginning of their sojourn in the desert. Chazal tell us that even before they came to Har Sinai, they were given the mitzvah of Para Aduma. And yet, this mitzvah is positioned here when we're already in the 40th year of the Jewish people's sojourn in the desert. The second is the story about Miriam's death, that Miriam passed away. And as we know, there was something called the Be'erah Shel Miriam, that it was the Miriam's well. And as a result of Miriam's death, the well dried up. And then the third passage is the story of Mei Merivah, where the people are thirsty and they thirst for water. Now, we're more familiar with the connection between the second passage and the third passage, of course. Because if you take a look at Rashi in source number 2, Vatama Sham Miriam dies, which is the very second passage right after the story of the commandment of the Para Aduma, the red heifer, the Torah tells us that Miriam dies. And Rashi asks the question, Lama nismacha parshas misas Miriam la parshas Para Aduma? Why does Miriam's death come immediately after the mitzvah of Para Aduma? Lomar lecha ma korbanos mechaprin af misas tzadikim mechaperes. It's to teach you that just like sacrifices atone for sin, so too do the deaths of the righteous atone for sin. So Miriam's death was an act of atonement, just like the bringing of a korban. What's the problem with this Rashi? Can anyone tell me that the most obvious, blatant problem with this Rashi? Come on, ladies. Somebody. The Para Aduma is not a korban. Does that not just jump out at you? The Para Aduma is not a korban. The Para Aduma is the taking of a cow that's with red hair, slaughtering it outside of the temple in an area that is overlooking the temple, not placing it on an altar, but incinerating it into ash, mixing the ash with water and using it as a purifying instrument for the Jewish people. So why in the world would that be called a korban? I suppose you could say in the most generic of senses it's a korban, because it's a sacrificial protocol in the sense that you have to slaughter an animal in order to do it. But it's not a korban in the conventional sense of bringing an offering to the Lord. And furthermore, if you wanted to give me a lesson about how the deaths of the righteous atones just like a korban atones, then you should have chosen a more conventional korban. Why not choose a korban chatas or a korban ola, which is listed in Leviticus, in order to get across that point? Why choose the Para Aduma? Okay, so that's our first question, which needs to be clarified. Now, the very next Rashi tells us, Vatama Sham Miriam dies, and if you take a look at Rashi, Rashi tells us, Af hi b'neshika meta, that she died also through the death that we call mitat neshika, through the death of the divine kiss. Now, who else died with the death of the divine kiss? What does Rashi mean when he says that she too died that way? Aaron and Moshe both died with mitat neshika. However, the Torah does not describe the death of Miriam in the more graphic way of a very, very placid and peaceful death. Why is it called mitat neshika? Because it is as peaceful and painless as just getting a kiss from your beloved. In other words, the soul departs in the most peaceful of ways, without any pain, without any discomfort, without any difficulty. The Gemara describes it as pulling a hair out of a glass of milk. It just comes out very smoothly, without any kind of thorniness or difficulty of getting it out. Now, the Gemara lists that there are over 900 different ways for a person to die. What the Gemara means by that is that what it's telling us is that the death is a process of separation between body and soul. And depending upon how you lived your life will determine how easy it is for the soul to separate from the body at the time of death. If you lived a virtuous life which was constantly focused on spiritual sustenance and not on the physical, then when it is time for your soul to depart, you'll say, you'll have that vision of, oh, there's the Malach HaMavis. It's time to go? No problem. Boom. And your soul just easily lifts out from the body. But if you lived a very physically focused life, where your idea of ultimate pleasure is a shopping spree at Yorkdale Plaza, or wherever, I'm just giving you an example, then the difficulty is going to be, there's the Malach HaMavis. Hold on a second, I'm not finished. I got to do this, and I got to take care of that. I got to pack, and the neshama is having a difficult time getting liftoff out of the body because there's a reluctance and there is a resistance to that separation. And so therefore the Gemara says the most difficult way to die for the person whose soul and body cannot separate cleanly is like trying to pull a thorn out of a ball of wool. So just imagine that illustration, that if you try to pull something thorny out of a ball of cotton or a ball of wool, what happens? You end up pulling a whole bunch of cotton or wool with you because there's not going to be a clean separation between the two. Now this is a very important point that I want you to stay focused on, that illustration of the ease of mitat neshika, which is very, very rare. It only occurs by truly, truly great tzaddikim who have no problem departing from this world, versus the average person and people who are more physically grounded, in that it's much more difficult for the soul to separate from the body. Now let's go on to the next story, which is the story of Mei Meriva. Now you and I are used to thinking that the obvious connection between the story of Miriam's death and Mei Meriva is, of course, because Miriam's well. So the well dries up as a result of her death, and it's necessary for God to regenerate the water coming from the well that had been previously been generated because of Miriam's zuchus. And now that she's dead, we need to regenerate the water. And so that's the obvious connection. But Rashi also points out, and Rashi tells us this in Pasuk Beis, V'lohaya mayim la'eda, there was no water for the nation to drink. Mikan shekol 40 shana haya lahem ha'be'er b'zchus Miriam. That for all 40 years until this moment in time, the water flowed in the merit of Miriam. Now, we also know that according to Rashi and according to many Meforshim, the reason that Moshe was punished was because he struck the rock instead of speaking to the rock. And Rashi says that explicitly over here. So there's an obvious question: why is striking the rock such a bad thing? I mean, after all, Hashem told Moshe, take your staff. And not only that, but if we look in Parshas Bishalach, which was right after the Jews left Egypt, we have a very similar story in a place called Masa Umeriva, which is also the Jewish people complain about thirst. They have no water to drink. And there, God explicitly instructs Moshe strike the rock so that water will come forth. And here now, it's such a terrible crime that he's striking the rock again, and instead of speaking to it. So what does he do that is so terrible that causes him to be denied entry into Eretz Yisrael? Now, of course, if you've ever studied Parshas Chukat before, you know that there is a tremendous amount of commentary here, and we're only going to be able to offer one vista, one view of what's going on over here. And of course, you know that there's many, many more. But let's try and understand one viewpoint. Our starting point is from the Shemi Shmuel, who quotes from his father, the Av Nezer, Rabbi Avraham Borstein of Sachachav. And he says as follows, if in source number 4, he says, Inyan me meriva, kavod kedushas avi admor zatzal. He says, my beloved father of blessed memory, the great Avnei Nezer, said, Higid mimasha amru zal tashmishei kedusha nignazin v'tashmishei mitzvah nizrakim. He cites from a Gemara that's very interesting. The Gemara tells us a halachic statement, and it says that when you've finished doing a mitzvah with a mitzvah item, you're permitted to discard it summarily. So what's an example of that? I have a lulav. When Sukkot is over, I can just throw the lulav in the garbage. No problem whatsoever. That's al pi halacha. So you'll raise your hand and you'll say, what are you talking about? You're supposed to save it to burn it with the chametz, right? That's not halacha, that's minhag. Halachically, however, from the viewpoint of the Gemara, once the mitzvah is done, there is no intrinsic kedusha to the lulav after Sukkot is over, and so therefore you can discard it summarily. By contrast, there's another Jewish artifact that cannot be discarded summarily, and that is what's called tashmishei kedusha. What's an example of tashmishei kedusha? A Torah scroll. Okay? Tefillin. Even after they have been worn out, let's say it becomes puzzle, it becomes no longer usable, a mezuzah, for whatever reason, they have intrinsic kedusha, even though you can't use them anymore because a name or a letter has been scratched out. And you have to discard it in the most respectful of ways by burying it. It has to go into geniza. Okay? So that's halacha, and that's cited by the Gemara. So what's the difference between the two? He says, Mizeh nir'eh shetashmishei kedusha nish'ar bahem roshem hakedusha v'tashmishei mitzvah ein nish'ar bahem kilum. He says that's the difference, is that after you've done your ritual mitzvah with tashmishei kedusha, like a Torah scroll or a pair of tefillin, there still is intrinsic holiness because God's name is etched into those items, and therefore there's residual holiness. There's residual holiness that remains. But when a mitzvah is finished and the holiday is over and the mitzvah is done, there's no residual holiness that lingers in the physical object. Okay? Now what does this have to do with Be'era Shel Miriam? So he explains. U'Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom machmat anvitanuto chashav et hasela shehu atzmo hatzur shebechorev letashmish mitzvah she'eno nish'ar bo roshem v'savar shehayat tzarich lahakoto kemo batechila. What does he say? He says like this: Moshe, out of his great humility, believed that once Miriam died, there was no intrinsic holiness left in this rock. Because after all, it was because of Miriam that there was any holiness at all. Now that Miriam is gone, I have to restart the process of generating water from a rock all over again. And therefore, just as God had originally commanded me to strike the rock, I must repeat this process in order to start from scratch, because there was no residual kedusha in this rock. But this was his error, and it was an error of humility. And I want to harp on that point in just a moment. Uve'emet, he concludes, hayat tashmish kedusha shenish'ar bo roshem ve'ein tzarich lahakoto rak b'dibur bilvad. But in reality, and this is where Moshe was mistaken, there really was residual kedusha in the rock, And therefore, it was not necessary to strike the rock, but only to speak to it, to be able to draw out the residual kedusha that was already there. Okay? So this is where I think that we're going to make progress in understanding the connectivity between these three things: the para aduma, the death of Miriam, and the story of Mei Meriva, of striking the rock and getting the water going again. The Maharal tells us, and we're not going to go into the Maharal in depth today, because he says it in a couple of places, but there's a portion of his commentary on Rashi in this week's Parsha which alludes to it as well. What is the reason why, when you want to purify someone from tumah, you sprinkle upon them the ashes of a red cow? Now, we're certainly not going to be able to fully explain the phenomenon of the para aduma, because the Torah says, after all, that it is a chok. But the idea of taking a living creature and burning it into its carbon basic material is really what the Torah is explaining happens when death occurs with the righteous. In other words, what you're trying to do is extract the basest physical material from a cow, which was originally a very, very complex living organism, and you extract the most basic carbon components, carbonized components of ash. When we talk about death, why does a corpse transmit tum'ah? Why does a corpse, after all, transmit any kind of spiritual phenomenon, either positive or negative, if after the soul separates from the body, all it is 98 cents worth of chemicals, or $1.98. I think someone once calculated how much a corpse is worth based upon what its chemical makeup is. What's a dead body worth, as far as if you were to break it down into chemical components? It's not worth very much. You could maybe get a little zinc. You could get a little.
Unless you have shaitel.
What?
Unless you have a shaitel, she says.
Right. The shaitel would be the most valuable part of the corpse, right? Yeah. That's a pretty. I thought I was being morbid. And then, there you go. Okay.
If you have gold teeth, you might have a
What?
If you have gold teeth, you might have
Gold teeth. Okay, but those are not part of the original human body. Okay, again, there you go. Okay. The point is, the only reason why a corpse transmits any kind of spiritual effect whatsoever is because of this idea that the soul and the body have not completely separated, a clean break. And the Maharal says this explicitly in a couple of different places. He explains that what is tumah? Tumah is the residual after the main part of the neshama has departed from the body. There's still a remnant of neshama that in a very, very weakened space, and that creates this spiritual vacuum which allows what this phenomenon called tumah. And it's for that reason that when a tzaddik dies, a tzaddik's body, according to the Gemara, does not transmit tumah. The rabbis tell us in the Gemara that it was permitted for Kohanim to get involved in the deaths and the funerals of the righteous people because their bodies did not transmit tumah. Those who die through mitat nishika, like the death of Miriam, their bodies do not transmit tumah because there's no residual whatsoever of their neshama remaining, inhering and adhering to their bodies. So the whole point of the para aduma, of the ashes, is to represent a complete breakdown of any complexity, of any spiritual component whatsoever of this cow, and to break it down in the most basic physical item. This is supposed to represent the atonement of tumah, which represents a remnant, a residual of spirituality which inheres within the dead body. Okay, that's the connection. Now we understand on a deeper level why there's a connection between the law of para aduma and the death of Miriam. Miriam's body did not need the atonement of the para aduma because she had already made the clean break. Moshe Rabbeinu's mistake was thinking that just like Miriam's soul separated from its body in the purest of forms, so too, the only zechus to give life to this rock, to be able to allow it to flow forth water, was the zechus, the spiritual essence of Miriam. And just like Miriam's neshama departed in its totality from the physical realm, so too, because she was the sole fueling force of this rock, her zechus completely departed from this rock, and therefore this rock is like Miriam's corpse, which is completely lifeless. There's no remnant of spirituality within it whatsoever. And here's where Moshe made a mistake of humility. His mistake of humility was to think that it was only because of Miriam that the water flowed for the Jewish people. The Jewish people needed to know, especially at this juncture of their existence when they're about to go into Eretz Yisrael, that even without the leadership of Miriam, you yourselves as a people are sufficient to give power and life to the rock that is still within your midst. And therefore, even though Miriam has departed, the spiritual energy necessary to power this rock and to allow it to give forth water still exists on some level within the people itself. And therefore, for you, Moshe, to have stricken the rock instead of speaking to it, implies to the nation that they do not have their own grace, they do not have their own merit in order to fuel the rock's spiritual power, in order to let it give forth its water. This is wrong, Moshe, because you have given a false impression to the people and made them feel too lowly, too unworthy to be able to continue on into the promised land. And as a result, you know how you need to atone for that? The way you atone for that is to allow the Jewish people to go into the promised land without their leaders. Because this was a mistake, Moshe thinking that it was only in the merit of the leadership of Israel that the Jewish people merited these miracles. Hashem says, I can't allow that to continue. The Jewish people need to gain confidence in themselves even without their leadership. And therefore, in order for them to gain that confidence, they're going to have to go into Eretz Yisrael without Moshe and Aaron, so that they'll be able to once and for all realize that God can be with the Jewish people and perform miracles for them, even without a Miriam, even without a Moshe, even without an Aharon. And so it's a very important message, I feel, in the larger context of what the Torah is trying to communicate to us, that as vital as tzaddikim are for the existence of Klal Yisrael, we all need to remember, and this goes back to what we started with in the Kuzari today, that despite the fact that great leadership is vital, each and every Jew has a little bit of a spiritual battery within himself or herself that is powerful enough to be able to bring great miracles to that individual. So while it's important to rely on our tzaddikim, and it's important to rely on our gedolim, and it's important to rely on our great leaders, we also have to rely on ourselves and have confidence in the people who we are.